If you understand that what I'm trying to do here is save you from yourself, like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. I'm willing to change the way that I think about tactics because change sometimes means doing things better, safer, and more efficiently. What I also think is interesting is that there's a lot of people out there who oftentimes will discredit other people of equal caliber, in my opinion, that have done a lot of things, spent a lot of time in the military, and have their own experiences. And I guess those people want themselves to be right, and apparently everybody else is wrong. I get my perspective on things through my own training, my own experiences, but also doing research. And I'm going to show you some of that here in this video. And one of the problems is that I think a lot of people are not familiar with what some of the most elite people in the world in the military have done during real operations that should call into question what you think you know well. Experience does not mean everything, because I think everybody has gotten advice from somebody with way more time on and more experience that you didn't think was necessarily correct or the best way of doing something. And I'm going to share a personal story with you here in a minute. I'm pretty sure that the tactics from the 90s and the 2000s on the policing side, or even in the military, of the things that they were doing, like, you know, running through houses like your hair is on fire with really no tactics at all, most people would say now that that is incorrect. And I'm sure back then when you tried to tell those people, I think there's a better way to doing something, they were probably resistant to that and didn't like the idea of change. And even now, every generation looks back on the previous generation of things that they were doing and says, that was probably dumb. And you also will probably change the way that you're doing things now in the future if you stick around long enough. 10, 15, 20 years, there's a good chance that some of the things you're doing now won't really be there anymore, and people will look at that and say, that's a little bit more dangerous. I think we have a better way of doing it. If you have access to drones, robots, gas, let's just say as a SWAT team, and you have those tools available to you, to your disposal, and you choose not to use those tools and something bad happens, like somebody gets killed, well, there's probably going to be a lawsuit, I would imagine, and people are going to be asking a lot of questions as to why we didn't use these tools to gain a tactical advantage. If you didn't see my last video on stepping center, I'll link that down in the description below so you can watch that. I advise that you do. But very briefly, I'm going to cover that because what I'm going to do here is provide a little bit more context and put this in a way in which more people will probably understand and get a better idea. So what I described in that video is a scenario where you have a threat inside the room, center the middle of the room, and you have two options. You can either dump into the room, check the hard corners first while that threat is shooting at you, and probably not pick up the threat at all because the first two guys are going to be shot. And, you know, focus on that third guy coming through the door to take care of the problem. Or you can get to the target faster by stepping center and seeing more of the room faster. one of the considerations, or the major consideration that I covered in that video, is focusing on vision. Where is our vision and when? And how does that affect how fast that we can get to the target? When you're faced with a real threat who's trying to kill you, obviously there's situations where you might want to just get out of the way or take cover. That does happen. But the priority should be stopping the threat as soon as possible. That's my opinion. Now, let's say, for example, that we don't utilize a real threat situation, and instead we do it this way. Let's say that this is a competition, and we can call it a competitive shooter competition, because what's really important to competitive shooters is shooting their vision, getting to the target as quickly as possible. Any little thing that they do as a competitive shooter that delays them getting to the target, well, it means like they don't do as well against other competitors. That's kind of the point. And all the little things matter. So let's say, for example, you're going up between 10 and 20 guys in a competition. You're standing outside of a room and you have two options. The instructor or the coordinator gives you two options. You can either step center and shoot this target in the middle of the room, or instead you can take the room, check the corner, and then shoot that target. And so the black line that you see here would be the starting position, and on the buzzer you can either step center and shoot that target, or you can go into the room, actually check the corner, because that's what you have to do, and then come around to the target. I don't really care how good you are, how fast you are, comparable to somebody else who's just as good as just as fast. You're not going to get to that target faster by going into that room. And so if you think of it in a competition aspect, I assume that you want to win. And that if you are the person going up against these other people and you chose the method of dumping into the room as your method, well, your score would suffer and you wouldn't do as well. And people might, kind of maybe say like, hey, that's not working out. Why are you doing it that way? That's kind of how I imagine that to happen. Now, earlier I talked about experience, and I talked about how experience doesn't necessarily mean you have all the right answers. So in this scenario here, I was getting ready to take a room, and I was the number one man, and our method was stepping center of the room before going in. So this wasn't a center-fed room, and it wasn't a corner-fed room, or a true center-fed or a true corner-fed. There was still area to the right, as you see here, that had to be checked. So if I'm where I'm standing, looking at the door, and the door comes open, the first thing I'm doing is getting as much of that corner as I can. And as I do that, I'm seeing quite a lot. And we'll just call it like a 10% of the corner that I can't see. So I step center, check center, there's nothing there. Which direction would you go in that situation? Well, one of the things that I talk about is understanding probabilities, likelihoods, and statistics, and factoring that into your decision making. Somebody left a comment and said they don't like the idea of probabilities and utilizing that because anything can happen, and that's true. But sometimes you're going to be put in a position where you have to make a choice, and you have to decide of the two choices which one sucks less. And so because I saw most of the corner, it still has to be checked. I bet on the fact that if there was somebody in this room, he's going to be to the left. Now, a gamey part of that is that we're using standing targets on target stands. So I know as a matter of fact, there's no target in that corner. There could be a person that weighs 90 pounds doing this. It's unlikely. And we'll just call it a 90-10% split of chance. So of course I step center, nothing there. I hit my corner to the left and there's a target. So I shoot the target. The number two guy comes in behind me, he goes to the right, and then he swings around and he also shoots the target. After that, I was essentially told that I should have went to the right. And at the time it didn't even, and actually it's not the most important thing here, that the one man is never wrong. I know everybody's heard that. I didn't even think about that. But what I was thinking is exactly what I explained to you. probabilities, likelihoods, and statistics. If I go to the right and there's a guy to my left, I'm getting shot and expecting and waiting for the number 2 guy to come in and get my back. That's what would happen in real life. So why would I make the decision and the choice to turn my back away from where I'm pretty certain the threat is going to be? And I think everybody would agree that that is the right thing to do, very similarly to your 2 options of dumping into the room, going left or going right. Now, somebody messaged me on Instagram and said, an instructor who I'm not going to name because that's not what I do, told them that you guys know this person too, if you're kind of in the space, that the reason he does not teach stepping center is because what will happen is that an officer will shoot that guy, which by the way is good because he's an immediate threat, and then instead of checking their corner, will walk into the room without checking corners. Probabilities, likelihoods, and statistics. How many times do you guys think, just as a side note here, that there's ever been a bad guy with a gun in a room in law enforcement with another bad guy in a room with a gun that was both trying to kill you? I don't know of a single incident that has happened. I'm not saying it has. This is usually where people go find 1 incident or 2 incidents and they tell me about it, which is great. I'd love to know about it. But in totality of incidents, probably have thousands of times where cops have shot a single person in a room and that was all that was there, and maybe a couple times where there was 2 threats. Again, probabilities, likelihoods, and statistics. And so what's better in that situation? Shoot the immediate threat and maybe get sucked in and miss your corner, if that's the worst case scenario, or again, going left or going right and just getting shot by that guy. I would argue that's worse. And also, if you shot the guy from outside the room, step center, and made entry and didn't check your corners, you f***ed up. You did what you weren't supposed to do, because that's not what's taught. So what you should have done is shot that guy, make sure he's down, and if he's not, you probably should keep shooting him. And then if you're going to make entry, you need to go. You need to pick a direction to go and do your job. That's what you should do. And if you don't do that, you did it wrong. And that's that person's problem that should be addressed. I'm going to read to you some information about a special forces operator who spent a lot of time in the military. And he is going to tell you essentially the basic method, which I covered, dumping into the room, and the story behind why they went to step center. Because unfortunately, what has to happen a lot of times is people have to get killed before people get the idea that something might be a bad idea. And so I don't know if people understand this or not, but I did not invent this or make this up. Jeff Gerwich is a retired U.S. Army Special Forces operator, 26 years of military service, 19 years with the Special Forces, 9 combat deployments starting with the 1991 First Gulf War, 3 tours in Iraq, and 3 tours in Afghanistan, in support of the War on Terror, along with the tours in Africa and other parts of the Middle East. He served as a primary marksmanship instructor to Special Forces, SOFREP, achieved Master Class in IDPA, 20 years experience in USPSA, 3-gun and 2-gun matches.
Refer to it as the classic method. That's what I learned way back in the FM 7-8 manual. That same manual now is ATP 3-21.8. It's the same technique in the current Ranger Handbook, and that is the 4-man stack. It's the old Battle Drill 6, enter and clear a room. That is where the 1 and 2 men, when they make entry, their primary job is to clear those corners. Number 1 man walking 2 corners, and the number 2 man is going to walk 1 corner. That's for a center-fed room. And the 3 and 4 man, their job is to clear the center threats. And for hallways, we were always taught, stay out of the hallways. It's a bullet magnet, so you want to limit your exposure in that hallway as much as possible. And that's really the classic technique. Really no different than what I learned during my time in the infantry. I spent 7 years in the infantry prior to SF. And the only big difference is in Special Forces, we had access to a lot more training ammo and really fancier shoot houses. But I didn't see really any difference between the tactics that we were using, both infantry and then crossing over into SF back in 1998. Towards the very end of 2003, the insurgency did start to pick up. It started the initial forms of that insurgency, and to deal with it, 5th Special Forces Group decided they were going to pair up normal Special Forces teams to conduct direct action raid missions against these early insurgent cells. And they had a few successes, and they had a bunch of what we call dry holes, meaning you hit the target and there's nothing there. But it was on one mission where they had 2 ODAs, roughly 24 guys, hit a target that had 3 determined fighters in that building that weren't going to give up. And the result, unfortunately, was 2 members killed in that joint Special Forces team mission, and they took multiple wounded. And that sent shockwaves through 5th Special Forces Group and really SF as a whole, where you had 3 bad guys against 24, and they were able to produce a lot of casualties before they were finally taken out. And that got a lot of in the Special Forces Command thinking, hey, maybe we're not as good as we really think we are when it comes to close quarter battle. Because the problem is when you're in a tight-knit unit, you're in a bubble because you are thinking, hey, we know the best techniques, we're the best of the best, tip of the spear and all that stuff, but you don't know what you don't know. And again, that those casualties on that 2 ODA mission that sent shockwaves and really made us realize that, hey, maybe we don't know everything. So we started to go to places like the Mid-South Institute of Combat Shooting, combat marksmanship programs, one of the best in the country. I know the Navy SEALs were using that place for CQB training for the longest time. We were going to Blackwater because they have, at the time, they had outstanding facilities, tons of different shoot houses to practice at. And we started to send SF guys to a place called the Direct Action Resource Center just outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, which is run by a Rich Mason. We call it Darcy for short. He runs a 6-day CQB course, and I believe my first trip there was in 2005, and it was a complete eye-opener. So I want to talk about Darcy and really some things that they were showing there, which actually I was resistant to when I first showed up. But man, it was an eye-opener once we started to get deep into this course. And in 2007, when I showed up, I was amazed at the changes that were going on in Sephardic at the time. And this is where I got to mention Sergeant Major Jack Nevels. Now, Sergeant Major Jack Nevels, he was there, I would say, during the heavy insurgency fighting in Iraq, 2005, 2006. We had all those different SIF units going into Baghdad and really doing that heavy urban fighting against these insurgent cells. And Sergeant Major Jack Nevels, he was looking at this and taking part in these actions, and he was realizing, hey, the current SOP, the classic method, 4-man stacks, was not working. And major changes were made based on his observations to how CQB was going to be taught and done in Special Forces. Some very, I would say, aggressive changes to the program. And one of the biggest changes is how guys entered the room. And this is where the step out, sometimes referred to as the flying V if there's a split stack on the door, but the step out was implemented. And it might be seen as a small change, but the effects were pretty, I would say, significant. And that is with the classic method, you're going to stack up tight on the door. You're trying to go in, number 1 and number 2 man, again, are clearing corners, and they're only engaging a center threat if it physically blocks their way into the room. Well, in reality, you cannot ignore any threats going into a room, and you're going to take casualties. So with the step out, the change is now the stack is going to be about 1 meter off the wall, or at least arm's distance off the wall. And as the number 1 man starts to approach the door, they start pieing off as much as they can see into that room, and they're allowed to shoot any threats that they see. When they can't pie anymore and they just have that blind corner to take, they take a positive step into the doorway. Any more threats that are present, they're allowed to shoot, but it's an aggressive positive step. and then you start walking forward. Now, once you cross the threshold, you are going to clear your corner, your emphasis focuses on that, and then you clear the room like normal. So with that step out, it gives time for that number one man to shoot any threats that could be visible. Because again, ignoring threats because your duty is to clear the corner first does not work in real life.
Now that I got that out of the way, I'm gonna read some of your comments on my last video. Someone said, there are levels to this game, and this is basic level stuff. Your explanation of step center is incorrect. Step center is not a pause. It is not a stop or engage from the outside of the room. Step center is a method of entry which is not meant to stop or slow down the flow. I would encourage you to go back to my video. You can go to the transcript down in the description, hit Control F on your keyboard, and search for the word stop. Search for the word pause, because I said neither of those two words in my last video. Step center is a method in which entry is not meant to stop, slow, or slow down the flow. You are not even talking about the highest probability of threat. This is a problem with 99% of tactical SWAT CQB officers stateside. They don't train to or understand the real dynamics of CQB. We also teach the most dumbed down level of 99% of cops, to include SWAT officers, cannot perform at a high level. It's just the truth, which is another reason why you should probably step center, because there is a good chance, well, first of all, that the majority of you that are watching this video and that are going to be out there on the street are not going to have somebody with you that's capable of doing the two-man's job. And that happens to me all the time. I don't have somebody getting my back. I don't have somebody with me that knows what they're doing. Again, that's kind of making my point.
And the other problem, when we're moving that snake movement,
Yeah.
there is only one muzzle working. All the other just muzzle up, waiting for number one to get killed,
Yeah.
and take his place. So it's not efficient enough. If I'm stuck to that threshold, if someone moving in front of me, I'll get surprised. It doesn't matter how good I am, I will surprised.
Yeah.
So when I'm taking a step back, I'll have more ability to deal with that, and I have more muzzles with me, because if I will engage from here, and I will be shot.
You got more workspace.
Yeah, I'll
can
be
move
shot
back,
with
you can move
with
to the
my
left.
team, and not in the second room. And that way, if I jam, I'll just move aside, and someone will take my place.
Yeah, even if you fall forward, you're still not crossing the threshold.
Exactly.
So you think the IDF has definitely learned a lot from conflict in the last year plus?
Every fighting force learning.
Someone said, we need to first understand the principles. And by the way, that last person, after I said that, and nowhere in my video did I use the word pause or stop, they deleted their comment. We need to first understand the principles before applying techniques. Deliberate clearance is or was meant for missions under nods and allowed the performing unit to be quiet as long as the circumstances dictate. Once the jig is up, those IR lasers went to white light, and dynamic it is again. Because again, surprise was lost. Now we can capitalize on speed and the execution of our room-to-room tasks and violence of actions to retake the initiative. We call that covert to compromise, and that is a thing that exists. But like I said, you guys need to look into these military incidents, these special operations that have happened, and actually look at the tactics involved and ask yourself, how does that conflict with what I know or what I was taught? And what I said to him was, yes, what you're saying is accurate, and that's what they teach. But I'm pretty sure when you crash a Black Hawk inside a compound, the jig is up and you've been compromised. I'm pretty sure when you're using mechanical breaching tools, you're probably compromised. I'm pretty sure when you're using explosives to breach things, you're probably compromised. I'm pretty sure when there's women and children crying, you're probably compromised. I'm pretty sure when you're shooting people, even with suppressed weapons inside of a structure, there's a good chance you might be compromised at that point. Any one of those things I just mentioned should have or could have caused those Navy SEALs to do exactly what he's saying, but they didn't. And one true story out of that, because obviously there's a lot of stuff that isn't true in a lot of these stories, is that one of the SEALs actually called out the name of one of the, the bad guys, I think it was Bin Laden the son or something, and caused him to peek around the corner, and he smoked that guy. Now let me ask you this question. Where is that taught? Nowhere. Let me ask you another question. If you were being taught CQB, right? Especially if you're supposed to be remaining covert, quiet, and creeping around, and you said, "Sir, what about if I try to call out his name and get him to come around the corner?" That instructor would say, "You're an idiot, don't ask any more questions, sit down." That's exactly what would happen. Again, true story, actually really cool, and a lot of the time, what solves these problems is unorthodox things that they don't teach you. There's another story that I'll tell you where, I believe it was the French commandos, I covered this one time and I can do it again, but essentially they did a pretty big movement, flew in on helicopters, did a big movement, got a significant gunfight, found the high value target they were after. The surveillance up above saw some suspected Taliban guys go into a compound. They went over there under nods to kind of track these guys down. They went inside. I get they were basically being covert. And when they got to the top of the stairwell, just like the Navy SEALs were doing, by the way, before someone says, well, they did it wrong, there was, at the top of the stairs, there was a room, and as the two operators are going to make entry into the room, two bad guys open up with AKs, shoot and down one of their guys who falls into the room. The second guy gets hit in his vest with his ammo on it, which explodes in his face, basically. It doesn't, kind of hurts him, I believe. He falls back basically onto his team, and for the next hour, they're trying to get to their buddy. Nobody ran into that room and did CQB, because that's a difficult thing to do when you're being shot at a lot. And how did they actually solve that problem? Well, they tried to solve that problem in a bunch of different ways. They had a couple guys, I believe, go up on the roof, and I'll find this video and I'll show it to you. In this video, actually, go up on the roof and try to shoot these guys through basically a hatch, and he starts getting shot at through the roof and has to basically get off on the roof. At one point, one of the guys in the hallway looking at the door gets into the prone position, and then he's finally able to put rounds on the door. Again, something they don't teach you and would tell you never to do. And then how they actually get in the room and solve that problem is they send their dog into the room, and when the dog starts attacking these dudes, they go in there and they kill them. And their buddy died. Where is any of that in this? Where is calling out people's names and getting them to turn around in this? Here's another video of Special Forces in Iraq, the Battle of Samarra, also called Operation Baton Rouge, which took place in 2004. And essentially there are some Special Forces operators integrated with some Iraqi military guys. And I know they're Special Forces, although it's not really documented, because they're wearing, the good ear pro, the comms, they have painted rifles, they have EOTechs, and there's only a few of them, integrated with a more significant number of Iraqi personnel. They go into this mosque and they encounter a door. How do they deal with this door? Well, one Special Forces operator pans the door, dumps 5 rounds into the door, and then I'm not sure if they use explosives or they got it open, maybe it'll show. The door comes open, and the first thing that you see is them doing an assessment from the door. I can almost assure you they didn't immediately go into the room, because it doesn't look like that's what happened, although it cuts. So what is that? Where do they teach that? Now, I understand those things actually happen in combat, and I also want you to understand that what you just saw there is one door in an ungodly amount of structural space with rooms and doors. What do you think they did at the other doors? Do you think, oh, they just did that once, that was a one-off thing? At the other doors, they made entry and did this. They dumped into rooms. And that was 2004, by the way, before Step Center actually came about. So I just think that's very interesting. Here's something else that you need to know. I've covered this topic before, and I'll show you the video of me covering this stepping center and shooting the target in the middle of the room and then taking my corner. And then I went and found a video that now you're seeing of a Delta operators doing what? Opening a door, standing in front of the door, shooting a hostage, kind of pausing, and then going into that room. If I told you before you saw that you should do that, or you should consider that, like I've kind of been saying, people would say no. People would say, no, don't do that. That's bad. Don't listen to what he's saying. But then it becomes problematic when I show you videos of the people saying that's wrong actually doing that. And you guys need to know about that stuff. And what I can also tell you, which is more than likely going to happen because this is usually what happens, is now that I'm pointing this thing out, people are going to make excuses as to why they did that. They might say, well, this is a small room, or, you know, he wasn't really plussed up yet to go take the room. And basically what they're trying to do is tell you and me that we didn't see what we just saw. I saw what I saw. I saw the door come open. I saw him stand in the threshold and shoot that hostage taker, which is kind of what I've been telling you guys could be an option. And people, again, have brought up hostage rescue and how that is much different than stepping center, like essentially take the room and hostage rescue and create angles, which I'm not saying you shouldn't do, but you may be able to shoot that person faster from where you're standing and you may have a shot. Or maybe that person's actually in that room by themselves and there isn't a hostage there. There's a bunch of different variables that could exist in that situation that you should just consider. My priority when somebody's trying to kill me and is capable and willing of killing me with the firearm is to not do anything that's going to delay me to putting rounds on that person. In my opinion, anything that suggests we're going to take longer to shoot that guy, in my opinion, isn't the best advice out there. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by commenting down below, and if you're not subscribed already, it would be cool if you were.